going to turn over control to our presenters for today. Kathy Kelly has been a master gardener since 2010. She currently maintains a small household garden using containers and other methods of planting. She concentrates her efforts on flowers. As a master gardener with more than 10 years experience, she provides a wealth of information on all sorts of gardening challenges. Lori Jagoda has been a master gardener since 2019. She rates herself as a still learning gardener. She raises vegetables, flowers, and landscape plantings on her balcony, in pots, and as a part of her home landscape. Dawn Martella has been a master gardener since 2020. She has been gardening since she was a little girl and currently maintains an extensive vegetable and flower garden along with her vineyard and landscape. Lori, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you, Ed, and thank you all for joining us this morning. We thought we'd start off with a few poll questions just to kind of find out where everybody's at in their gardening experience. So Doris, if you want to put the first poll up.
Okay, here it goes.
So, okay, I guess we've got them all on one here. Okay, so there's 3 questions. Do you consider yourself a relatively knowledgeable gardener? You can pick either yes, I think I'm a relatively knowledgeable gardener, or no, I have a lot to learn. The next question, which of the following do you currently grow? And check all that apply. We've got vegetables, root vegetables, herbs, flowers, or you've never grown anything. And then how big is your gardening space? Indoor only, balcony only, small outdoor place, or over a ½ acre? So we will give a minute here. We've got 32 people signed on. I know some of us are the working team here, but we'll see how many answers we get. Okay, we've got 15 of 24, so we'll give it just another minute here. Okay, looks like we're still a few more coming in, but primarily we have a lot to learn. You're kind of like me, even though I have been a master gardener for a few years, there's always something to learn. Vegetables, root vegetables, herbs, flowers, okay, are the primary things grown. Looks like flowers are the most popular.
Lori, do you want me to end the poll?
We're at 21. Yeah, go ahead. I think that's probably enough. Thank you. And then it looks like a lot of you have a small outdoor space or a large outdoor space. So that's good. All right. Well, what we're going to discuss today is primarily vegetable gardening, but you can apply a lot of these principles to growing just about anything. And I hope that we are able to provide you with some information. And we're new with polls, so I apologize here. I've just shared the poll results. So, okay, I'm now going to move this on to Kathy Kelly to kick us off. But first, let's go over the objectives of today. Ed, next slide. So today's objectives are to learn the basics for gardening, specifically to Amador County. Learn about different planting bed options, learn what kind of soil works best, and learn what to plant and when. If you don't live in Amador County, as Ed said, we do suggest that you check with your own local master gardeners and the resources there. Okay, Kathy.
Okay, Ed, next slide, please. I have started off several of my presentations with this thing from Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, and it used to hang in our master gardener office. I think it's not there anymore. Anyway, so when I was initially taking the master gardener training, we were asked what appealed to us about gardening. And my comment then, and still is, I feel very well one with God, myself, and nature when I'm working with in the garden. It's just a very peaceful, satisfying place to be. And this saying of Gandhi epitomizes that feeling, and I hope you share it too. Okay, Ed, next slide. Okay, first of all, so now we're getting into the part about setting up your garden initially. Start off small. Don't bite off more than you can chew. There are many factors that will be involved to get everything going, especially this first year. A lot of it's going to require intentional thought this year. It will very quickly fade to your, to the back of your mind. This is not meant to be the least a bit bragging, but those of us who have gone through this several times in setting up a garden, or even just one time, we can tell you how true this is. It will not continue to be something you have to think about. As time goes on, you will be able to focus on other parts of gardening, so you continue to learn. Because of the drought, I've gone back to small, and I think everybody should. COVID has really taken the lead in what they're focusing on in the news, but we are really in a drought. In fact, and I just got back from Oregon not too long ago. They're in a drought also. So it looks like maybe it's just, or not, it's not just the West Coast, who knows, but certainly looks like the West Coast is feeling it. Okay, Ed, next slide. Hello. Thank you. All right, so you start out, you choose your site. Now, as it happened when I was invited to join this discussion or putting together this presentation, I had just moved and I was putting up my own, or establishing my own garden in the back. So you can see where there's 3 small pipes actually that are in the ground. I ran into a problem that I've never encountered in all of my years of gardening. But I have a huge amount of crabgrass, and the best way to deal with that is to sink small pipes, short, big water pipes into the ground, and then fill them with good soil and hope that I can get rid of, just be able to plant in those pipes. That you'll see a bit, that eventually you'll see this beginning of an outline is to where I will put up the fencing, because I do have a lot of a deer problem. So I will need to have the fencing. Anyhow, so there's a couple of things that you will really need to consider when you're setting this up, and that's your morning and afternoon sun exposure. You usually need at least 6 to 8 hours of sun, maybe even a little bit more. You absolutely for certain need access to water. I mean, that is totally crucial. Things are just not going to happen without the water. And then, like as I said, I ran into problems with, I have gophers out there. I haven't seen voles. Gophers, I'm not certain exactly what I'm using the hardware cloth. And then we'll get into the soil type, the different types of soil. Ed, next slide, please. The last presenter in the class today will teach you how to establish an automatic watering system. I really, really prefer an automatic system. Yes, you can water by hand, but I have to say that I have only seen one person in my entire life who was reliable enough and consistent enough in how she did her watering that it worked. However, when she wanted to go away, then she had the problem. So with automatic watering, you don't have that kind of a problem. Okay, and next slide, please. Most of us here in Amador County find that we have to have an enclosed growing area, largely to keep out deer. They look at our gardens as just terrific buffets, and we don't want them eating it all up as a buffet, especially towards the end of summer, when up in the high hills, water and good green stuff gets minimal. They come back down here, but they'll even get you started off early on with your growing. So there's 2 types of fencing that you can put in. One is your basic metal fencing, which lasts for I don't know, a very, very long time. The metal fencing, it's galvanized, it's wired together, all the rest of it, and it works really well. It works beautifully. However, it's quite pricey. The alternative to that is plastic fencing that will last about 12 to 15 years. Because of the price difference, I can afford to put in plastic fencing a couple of times before I equal the metal fencing, the cost of metal fencing one time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about growing mediums. One growing medium that has become kind of popular in the last several years is straw bales. I personally don't recommend that for beginners. It takes a lot more work to get it going. Once it's going, it's terrific. But getting it going initially really requires a lot of work. The one good thing I really like about the straw bale, in our teaching garden here, the Master Gardener's teaching garden, we have an example of a straw bale garden. We set up, I believe it's vegetables growing in it. At the end of the summer, when we're putting everything to bed, we break everything apart. We go in, we just start cleaning the whole place up. The black stuff that comes out in the middle of this straw bale is absolute, it's black gold is what it really is. And it's terrific for putting on your, your planting area over winter. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another option is to have containers. They provide tremendous flexibility. In other words, you can move your pot to wherever is the best situation. Obviously, you're going to have to bring your watering along with it. The containers need to have hardware cloth on the bottom. Now, here's the mistake. This word should be unless, not if. Unless the holes in the bottom of the container, if the holes in the bottom of the container are large enough for a gopher to get through. If a gopher can make his way into the pot, he will. They do that sort of a thing. So you line the bottom of your pot with hardware cloth, or you put your pot down on the hardware cloth, one of the two. But here are the cons of it. Even the large ones do provide a limited growing space and therefore require frequent watering. This is especially true if you're using light-colored pots. In fact, dark-colored pots. Never use dark-colored pots. The dark color absorbs the water much more, and therefore everything dries out a lot faster. Then the other thing of it is that the containers don't shade the roots or plants above or below the soil. I thought it was just above the soil. The next slide, I hope. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's the pictures of my roses from last year. And it took me until almost the end of summer before I realized this problem about the shading of the roots under the soil. You'll see that a lot of my plants, the leaves were all just really crispy. Nothing much was happening, no matter how much I watered. I finally got a clue that what I needed was to wrap the pots with shade cloth also. And not wrap them tightly, leave an airspace between the shade cloth and the pot. I did that, and it really helped reduce how much watering they needed, and the plants did start to look better. So next slide, please. Okay, so here we're taking a detour for a minute to talk about hardware cloth. This is the stuff that we use to keep gophers out. Voles come in bottom or the top, mostly the top, but they'll keep the gophers out. You can see where this is looking down the pipe that I had showed you in my garden. And what we did was we just placed some hardware cloth underneath the pot. So there's openings in the hardware cloth so the roots can grow out through there. And yes, the gophers can get to those roots, but they can't get into the roots they can't get close to the plant. They can't kill the plant. So there's a picture on this on the left here that shows you what a roll of the hardware cloth, what it really comes out looking like. On the right is a gopher shield. You can buy them, but depending on the size of the pot that you have. I don't know that they go up to really, really tall or really, really big, I mean. But it's kind of an expensive way to do it. I prefer buying the hardware cloth and then just molding it to the bottom of the pot and being finished with it that way. Next slide. Okay, now raised beds. These are the most similar to growing in the ground. Your raised bed, though, should be at least 18 to 24 inches deep. A lot of your vegetables in particular have deep roots. they have, maybe 18 to 24 inches, where if you have a pot that's only a couple of inches deep, where are the roots going to go? But so that's one of the reasons it should be deep. The other reason is that if it's too shallow, it's going to require watering really, really frequently. And when we're in a drought, especially, you don't really want to get yourself into that problem. Also, since there's no native soil, we'll talk more about soil in a little bit, but since there's no native soil, that's the soil that is just there in the ground around you. You get to provide a totally healthy and rich environment. We'll talk more about how you do that in a while. And then I line the bottom of each of my raised beds with hardware cloth. I couldn't find any pictures of that, I'm sorry. But anyway, I have them lined completely. I actually wrap the hardware cloth up around the sides, so I come up the sides. So there is just no way that a gophers can get in there. Now, the downside, they cost money to build. Pecky cedar is one of the best ones. Although not too long ago, I bought some pecky cedar to make one. It was too pecky and not very much cedar. So it wasn't that great. Another option would be some sort of redwood. That really gets pricey. Using plywood is, you can use the marine plywood, but otherwise it's likely gonna delaminate from all of the water that goes into it, that is required in your raised bed. Next slide, please. Now, in the ground, this is the most natural. This is what the plants really thrive on the best. However, more than ever, you have to wait until the soil really gets warmed up enough. Even in raised beds, you can warm your soil will be a little bit warmer than it would be in the ground, and that's what really makes the difference when you put in plants, is how warm your soil is. You do have to do more soil amendment and blend, and then towards the edges of each hole that you dig, you have to gradually dig it into, blend it into the native soil. You can put pots of hardware cloth under each plant. Truthfully, most of us don't. I can't really give you a good reason for it, but we mostly seem to get by with it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now you've chosen your site. So here you have the garden is wrapped up. You have the fencing put up around it. You've built your raised bed, and you have identified a nearby water source. Next slide, please. Okay, now you'll have something else to do. This is like the real fun stuff of gardening. The thing that they don't tell you in the Master Gardener, or tell you a lot about in the Master Gardener training. You have to weed the area before you plant. Weeds often outcompete plants for the water and the nutrients in the soil. So it is wise to pull them on a regular basis. You can't, you have the most weeding to do initially, up front before you start, but even as time goes on, you still need to keep pulling out your weeds. You just don't want to let weeds get going where you're growing stuff. Here's a list of the tools that you'll need. And on the next slide, I'll show you that we have pictures of what each of those is. So next, let's go on to that. Next slide, please. So we have the digging shovel. You use whichever tool works best for you. So, and these are the ones that I use the most often. Different folks, I'm sure, will choose different tools, but this is what obviously having gloves and kneeling pad is really good. Clippers, there's not really much use for them, but the place where I keep my tools is so far away from my garden that I just bring them out and have them there with me. I often enough end up wishing I had them, and I'm just too lazy to walk all the way back. The rest of the tools I use all of the time. Okay, so next slide, please. And now we'll get into determine what kind of soil you have. Now, this is particularly targeted at Amador County. It may apply elsewhere. That's why we really recommend, though, that you talk with your local Master Gardener folks where you do live. The soil in Amador County almost always has some amount of clay in it. if it's got a lot of clay, I've only encountered that a couple of times. The soil, it's kind of has like a sticky quality to it. And if you have a lot of clay, the water will not penetrate at all. I mean, you can leave water in a clay hole for 2 or 3 days and the water level will just not really go down. If it only has some clay, well, that's how you determine how much clay you have. Put water into a small hole and see how fast it drains. Sandy soil, which is mostly found around areas that either are or were streams or something of that sort, it's highly likely won't have clay in it, but but the water will almost run through it. Either way, you need to amend your soil to make your soil richer, and with sandy soil to make it hold water more. The more nutrients though that you have in the soil, the healthier your plants. But on the other hand, do not make the mistake. When we first started our Master Gardener teaching garden, we decided to use it as for experiments. And so we had one bed had 25% compost, another one had, 50%, 75%, and then we got to one that had 100%. Well, the water just went straight through it. We ended up having to take the whole thing apart and redo it. So don't ever fall into making your soil just pure compost. It's nice and rich, but it doesn't hold water. And that's extremely important to a plant also. Okay, next slide. Okay, so nearby here, there's a place called the Boyle Ranch. And they have lots of horses. They have, I don't know, 30 or 40 horses there. So they get tons of manure from the horses. And they have 2 separate piles. One is the current, that year's pile. And then they have the aged pile. And they will, for little to no money, they will sell you, or they will let you have as much manure as you need. So it's the major place that I know, or excuse me, as much compost as you need. It's a major place that I know of around here that has this manure for you. However, so you add these other things to your soil, then buy a few bags of good soil amendment from your nursery. Just look for amend or amendment, or just the word amendment somewhere on the bag. And then you mix all this into the dirt that is there. So you've dug the holes, you have a pile of what we call the native dirt. You mix all of this good stuff into there. However, the closer, if you're planting in the ground, keep the soil, feather it out, the amendment, feather it out as you get closer and closer to where the roots would be going straight into native soil. They need to be gradually worked away from or weaned off of having the really good stuff and get braced for having just the plain old native soil. However, if you choose a container to grow in a container or a raised bed, ignore all these words about native soil. Okay, next slide. And then the last is the final step in this whole thing is putting in your automatic watering. You really should put that in before you plant, because your plants are going to need to be watered absolutely as soon as they're in the ground, and then continually from then on. So after you've gone to all of the work of planting, you're going to feel like maybe taking a day or 2 off and before you go out and put in your watering system. On the other hand, if you already have your watering system in before you put the plants in the ground, you finish up the job, you walk away, and it's done. So you take your choice, but I really, really prefer putting my watering in before the plants are in the ground. Another thing I saw not too long ago, a neighbor of mine was growing tomatoes, and what he did was he took about half-gallon cans and sunk them into the ground, but leaving the can open, just sunk them down to ground level. And then whenever he would water his tomatoes, he would fill up those cans. This was particularly true in the middle of summer when things got really hot. And with the can already that far down in the ground, the water got closer to the roots, the deeper roots of the plant. But his plants were really healthy. I'd never seen it done before. I thought it was a terrific idea. Okay, next slide. Okay, so at last you can go out and buy your plants, or maybe if you've already bought them and have been nursing them along with watering and stuff, you could do that for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. I would recommend buying small plants that have already been started. If you're planting in to start from seed, I'd say start this way with the small plants, and then in future years, if you want to start getting into growing from seed, that's fine. But you have enough already to figure out for this first year. So just put that growing from seeds aside for the moment, and then get into that one later. This is one of the fun things about growing, I think, is that you get to continue branching out and focusing on different things each year. And it's always a work in progress. It never, ever stops, which is probably one of the reasons a lot of us find it kind of an interesting hobby. It never ends. Next slide, please. Okay, now, if all else fails, call in some friends, but then expect them to take breaks. One of my friends, after he had been digging some holes for me, because getting through this crabgrass was difficult. But after he showed how you can take the wheelbarrow, turn it over, and there's a lovely chair. So there he is resting in his chair, and his friend standing by, just smiling. So that's really all. Now let's turn this over to Lori Jagoda and see what she has to say.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Okay, so now you've selected your site, you prepared your beds and soil, and you've gathered all your tools. It's time to think about what to plant. Next slide. So before you plant, it's important that you know your zone. You use a planting guide that's specific to your area, and you plan ahead. Next slide. So before choosing your plants, you need to consider what zone you're in. And this is important in order to select plants that are appropriate for where you live. If you pick the wrong plant for the wrong zone, you're not going to have a very successful garden. So zones are divided into 2 different types. The first is the USDA zone. They have tested agricultural and ornamental plants and tested them for the lowest temperature that they'll thrive. And they've been revised to reflect climate warming. So there are 11 different zones for the USDA zone. They're usually by zip code. And I've included a link here, which I found pretty useful. You can actually go there and type in your home address, and it'll tell you exactly what USDA zone that you're in. Now, the sunset zones were popularized and researched by Sunset Magazine. And they use much more criteria to come up with their zoning. So they look at a combination of extremes and averages of minimum, maximum, and mean temperature, rainfall, humidity, and the length of the growing season. So there's 24 climate zones that are more precise using sunset. And you need to be sure that you're looking at the correct zone. For example, sunset zones 7 and 8 are much warmer than USDA zones 7 and 8. And you want to be sure you're looking at the right thing. So use all this as a starting point. Before you grow or buy your plant, you need to learn everything about your site and the plant. Next slide. And this is a copy of Amador County, the USDA zones. And you can see there are 8 zones here, ranging from 6A up to 9B, primarily because of all of the elevation change in Amador County. And the 6A is the light pink, and it's down in the Ione area. And then we go up to 9B, which is further up country. Next slide. But if you look at the Amador County sunset zones, this is not the best graphic, but the best I could find. They say we have 3 zones, 9, 7, and 1A. And so zone 9 is in Ione this time, as opposed to the USDA, where the smaller number was. Next slide, please. But we also need to take into account microclimates, because zone maps don't tell us about that. And these are small areas in your garden that may have different weather. So a good example of a microclimate is a mountain. The largest microclimate would be the whole mountain, which has different weather based on elevation, but smaller microclimates are the north and south sides of the mountain. So in small areas in the garden, you may have a spot that differs from your general zone. Cool shade under a large tree on a hot summer day may be a microclimate, just like areas where increased light and heat are reflected from a wall may have a little different microclimate there. So you kind of know you have a microclimate if certain plants are supposed to be hardy in your zone, but they continue to die in your garden. You may have a cold microclimate. Or if you're growing a zone 8 plant in zone 7, you may have a warm pocket. So it's just something to consider when you're planting your garden. And you'll know after experience what works and doesn't work. We also suggest you check with your neighbors too, because if they've been successful gardeners, they're often a good resource for what to plant. Next slide. So next I want to talk about planting guides. We often hear on seed packets especially, it says, plant when the danger of frost is past. Well, what exactly does that mean? So the average dates for fall frost and late spring frost are monitored and published by the National Climate Date Center, and they base it on a 30-year average, and they recompile it every decade. Now in Amador County, May is truly planting time for most summer vegetables. So in the lower portion of the county, Ione and Jackson, planting can possibly start in mid to late April. And at mid elevations, like where I'm at in Pine Grove, May 1st to the 15th is a good time to consider planting. Whereas if you live up country in Pioneer or higher, you need to wait until May 15th or later. But all of this, again, depends on your microclimates. These are just averages. So you need to consider the elevation delay where you live when planning to put in your garden. So planting and harvest dates are for a typical garden at 2,000 feet in Amador County. For the planting guide, I'm going to show you in the next slide. You need to adjust the planting dates by about 1 week for each 1,000 feet above or below 2,000 feet. So in Ione, if you're 1,000 feet less than 2,000, you could plant yours a week earlier than the dates on this guide. And then if you live up in Pioneer, you need to wait another week. We have planting guides available specific for Amador County, and I searching the internet, I did find some for other counties too. So again, check with your own local master gardener. Next slide. And this is just a graphic that one of our master gardeners put together for warm weather vegetables, when to plant, when to expect to harvest, things like that. And there's a link at the bottom there that'll take you to that document, as well as I think we've included it in the resources at the end. Next slide. So you need to plan ahead. And as Kathy said, seeds take longer to mature than transplants. When planting perennials, put them in a corner so they won't be disturbed by the more frequent cultivation required by annuals. Plan for vegetables that best utilize the space that you have available. And consider other garden needs like mulch, fertilizer, water, etc., that either have been covered or we're going to cover later. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about what to plant, plant types, seeds versus transplants, the actual planting, thinning, trellising, staking, and when to harvest. Next slide. So I think this is the fun part, is what to plant. Well, you need to consider, what do you and your family like to eat? I mean, that's a good place to start. Plant as much as you can easily and are willing to maintain. I think a lot of new gardeners think you just put it in the ground and wait for it to grow and then pick it, but there is a lot more work to it. Not that it's not fun, but it does take a little more time and care. So consider that when starting out, and we suggest starting small. Look for varieties that adapt to your area, and you want to consider plants that have disease resistance. Consider their maturity date and their compactness as well. Next slide. So the next few slides, we're going to look at plant types. So let's just go on to the next slide. There are plants that are called indeterminate versus determinate. And this is typically in reference to tomatoes, but other varieties also can be indeterminate or determinate. So an indeterminate plant, which is shown on the left there, and tomatoes are often called vining tomatoes because they continue to flower and bear fruit over the course of the season until the plant's killed by frost. These can grow up to 6 feet tall or higher. They require staking or caging for support, and they also require removal of suckers. You should wait until 2 leaves develop before removing those. Now, a determinate plant is more like a bush plant or a bush tomato, and they grow vertically first and then stop, and the remainder of the growth occurs on the side shoots. They usually grow about 4 feet tall or less. The difference is their crop bearing is only over the course of 4 or 5 weeks, and then it's done. The plant requires minimal staking, and they tend to be more compact and manageable, but not always. Now, these are the kinds of plants that are suitable for container planting, and they perform well in 5-gallon plants. So be sure and read those labels when you're purchasing your plant. And also, determinate tomatoes don't require heavy pruning or sucker removal to get a good crop. Next slide. So next, let's talk about hybrid versus open pollinated. Hybrid plants are those that have been crossbred by human intervention. They're not true to type, and they're bred for specific improvements in the plant. So they result from the controlled crossbreeding of 2 different but very specific varieties of the same plant with the goal to achieve a new variant that is superior to either of the parents. And they're superior in areas like disease resistance, better taste, etc. However, you can't save these seeds, or you can, but you're not likely to get the same plant the next year. And you need to purchase new hybrid seeds each year. And they are just a little bit more expensive than the non-hybrid seeds. Now, open pollinated are seeds that reproduce just like the parent for generation after generation. And heirloom tomatoes is a very popular term that we hear these days. Now, to be true to the definition of heirloom, it needs to be a species or plant that was introduced more than 50 years ago. It has to have a history of its own. But one of the benefits of planting heirloom plants or open pollinated is that you can save the seed and be reasonably confident that you're going to get the same kind of plant the next year. Next slide. Now, we talked earlier about annual, biennial, perennial, but what exactly does that mean? Well, an annual plant is one that completes their life cycle in just 1 growing season. So lettuce is an example of an annual plant. Biennials complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons, and they often go dormant in the winter and then send up new vegetative growth and flowers the second year before they die. So the most famous examples are cole crops like broccoli and cabbage, but these are often treated as annuals in the garden. Other biennials are parsley, carrots, and leeks. Perennials are the category of plant that lives for many years. They vary greatly on how long it takes for them to produce their first flowers or seeds and reach senescence or old age. So examples of perennials are asparagus, artichokes, rhubarb, horseradish, and most herbal plants are perennials as well. Next slide. Now, transplants are plants that are 6 weeks old or older. And as Kathy said, we do recommend these for beginning gardeners. It just makes your life a little bit simpler. They're the preferred choice, for certain vegetables, with the exceptions including those with long tap roots like carrots, parsley, and cilantro. You want to look for plants that are short, stout, and healthy. They shouldn't be producing flowers, buds, or fruit yet, and the roots shouldn't be sticking out of the drainage holes. Choose plants that are in 6-packs or 4-inch pots. Larger container plants usually take longer to settle into their new homes, and they don't bear as prolifically as the smaller ones. Next slide. Now, here's a chart that tells you how to go about planting your transplants. You want to handle them by their leaves, not their stems. Plant them at the same depth that they grew in their containers. The exception is tomatoes. Tomatoes, you want to pinch off all but the top several leaves of the plant. You want to dig the hole deep enough to plant the tomato up to its top leaves, and then the plant will develop roots all along the stem that you have buried. So otherwise, dig the hole 2 inches wider and deeper than the root ball. Loosen up the soil and the roots around the root ball to help stimulate new growth. Firm the soil gently, and then water the plant 3 times to fully saturate the root ball and the surrounding soil. You want to provide shade against late afternoon sun for about a week, and then begin watering deeply every other day or once or twice a week as necessary. But Dawn's going to talk a little bit more about that in her section of the presentation. Next slide. And I just wanted to include this graphic for how to transplant a tomato. You can see that all of the leaves have been pinched off, and it's been buried all the way up to those top leaves. Next slide. Now, transplants versus seeds. Seeds do give you a much wider variety to choose from. General guidelines for starting seeds are you need to sow them 6 to 8 weeks before plant dates. So if you're thinking of doing that this year, you need to start doing this now to be ready later in May. If you're reusing old containers, wash them thoroughly and then soak it in a solution of 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. Use a light porous seed starting or potting mix, and don't forget to label your plants. They all kind of look alike when they first start sprouting. Excuse me, next slide. So how to read a seed packet. This is something that is pretty important, and I'm not sure that people take it seriously, but the information on the packet is vital towards successful growing of that particular plant. They do differ from one company to another, but most do offer a brief description of the plant, how and when to sow the seeds, and what type of environment they need to germinate and grow. And I've included a link to a document that goes into some of the information I'm going to cover in much more detail. One thing that's on a seed packet is the germination or days to emerge. So this is a range how long from sowing the seed until the first green of the seedling begins to show. Date to harvest and maturity is important. It estimates the time from sowing the seeds to the first harvestable fruit. And this is going to vary widely based on the area that you live, the weather, the soil, etc. But you want to use this to compare different vegetables when you're buying your seeds. So if you want an early crop of sweet corn, you're going to choose one that has the shortest days to harvest or maturity. Now, for plants that are typically started indoors, like tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, things like that, you start counting the days from the date of transplanting into the garden rather than from the date of sowing to get your harvest or maturity date. It's very important that you use fresh seeds, so seed viability. If it doesn't have the date stamped on the package, be sure and write it on the year that you opened it. Use the freshest seeds possible for the best results. And some seeds like onion, parsley, and parsnip lose their viability after about a year. But seeds from other vegetables are good for about 3 years or more if they're properly stored in containers in a cool, dry place. Planting depth is real critical to seed germination. If you've ever planted seeds and nothing popped up, it's probably because you planted them at the incorrect depth. So the rule of thumb is plants need to be planted at a depth twice their width. Plant spacing or thinning. Usually more seeds get planted than are needed. And if you have too many seedlings, they can compete with each other for survival. So we're going to talk about thinning in a later slide. And then seed packets contain information on how much sun is needed, the soil types, etc. These tips are not optional and should be taken seriously if they are included on the seed packet. And again, be sure to label what you plant. Next slide. So thinning. This can be one of the hardest things to do for people because we want to keep them all. I know that's how I feel about it. But you need to thin plants, excuse me, to allow the strongest seedling to grow. When you do thin, make sure they're not too wet. It makes it easier to separate them. Keep that seed packet that you planted them from so you can review the plant spacing needs, and then remove the unneeded seedlings by carefully pinching at the top of the plant or cutting it off at the base. And you typically do this about 3 weeks after plants sprout, and you choose which one looks the best to keep and the rest to remove. And if you really don't want to throw them away, you can add those sprouts to a salad or a sandwich. Next slide. So hardening off. This is a short period of mild stress just before transplanting. You don't want to put them out too early and have frost kill them all. And if you plant them at the correct time, it makes for the best growth and the happiest plants. So a couple weeks before you intend to plant, put them outside, you check for your last frost date, and over a period of a few days, you take the plants outside to a sheltered spot, no cooler than 45 degrees, and you protect them from the wind and put them in weak morning sunshine. And these pictures here show a couple different ways to protect them from the elements when you're hardening them off. Gradually increase the amount of sunlight by an hour or two each day until they can be out all day. And then you can leave them out overnight as long as there's no risk of frost. You want to reduce the water a little, not so much that they dry out, but to encourage the thickening of the cell walls so they become stronger. Excuse me. Okay, next slide. Oh, and also just one more point on that previous slide. This is only for seedlings that you plant. Anything that you get from the nursery has already been hardened off. Okay, trellising or staking. You don't want to grow horizontally. Anything you can grow vertically. I look back on my mother's garden when I was a kid, and she had a lot of area, but I know a lot of her plants just kind of sprawled all over the garden. She never did trellis or stake. And it makes more effective use of the land that you have for your garden. So vining crops like tomatoes, squash, cucumber, and pole beans, they do use a lot of space when allowed to grow along the ground. So using trellises, stakes, or cages minimize the ground space used and increase productivity. It prevents sunburn in some of the plants, and it also makes for better quality fruit and vegetables. So crops typically needing support, as we said, are the non-determinate tomatoes, pole beans, most peas, cucumbers, melons, and fava bean. And then there's some pictures there of what the support materials can be. Pinterest is one of my go-tos just for some unique ideas how to stake or trellis. Next slide. Ed, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, now for the fun part. We finally made it to harvesting. So based on personal preferences is when you harvest. Gourmet or baby vegetables are merely vegetables that are harvested when they're small. But the important thing to remember is that your vegetables will be crisper and cooler if you harvest them in the early morning. Don't refrigerate tomatoes to prevent chilling injury, which causes a mushy texture or loss of flavor. So you want to harvest at the best stage for eating and store them under conditions that will keep them as close to garden fresh as possible. And I've included a link here for another document that has a lot of good information about how to store the different vegetables that you harvest from your garden. Lettuce and leafy vegetables can be harvested a few outside leaves at a time, leaving the center to continue to grow. The important thing is to keep them picked often. If you're not harvesting soon enough, the plant will produce a chemical that will inhibit further blossoming. So check them at least every other day. And then harvest only what you can eat in the next day or two. Towards the end of summer, you want to pinch off the blossoms, the last blossoms of eggplants, peppers, melons, squash, tomato, to reduce the energy to the maturing vegetables that have already set, instead of setting more fruit that won't ripen before fall cold weather. And this was something I really wasn't aware of. I had more green tomatoes that if I had done this, I probably would have had a better tomato crop. Next slide. And this is just a picture of that document from the prior slide. Tells you what to store in the refrigerator, what you can ripen on the counter and then store in the refrigerator, and what should be stored at room temperature only. Next slide. So no matter how good you are, you're going to have some plant pests and diseases. So the general rules of thumb to keep your garden healthy is to protect your young plants, water the soil, not the plant leaves, grow disease-resistant varieties, keep your garden clean. You can pick off the larger insects and caterpillars by hands. Try hosing off smaller pests. That works best for spider mites and aphids. And then you can use insecticidal soap. And this is a link to a more detailed document regarding that. So soaps will kill many insect pests, including aphids, white flies, soft scale. Because there are soaps, they have little or no residual action. So you're going to need to apply them on a regular basis until the population is controlled or eliminated. And to be effective, these sprays need to be applied directly to the insect and cover it thoroughly. It's important to remember, though, not to apply this in the hot sun. So do it early in the morning when it's not too warm out. Now, you may have heard that some household soaps also make effective insecticides. In particular, certain brands of hand soaps and liquid dishwashing detergents can be effective, and they are less expensive. However, there is an increased risk for plant injury because they aren't designed specifically for use on plants. Next slide. Okay, common garden pests. So here's a list of the common ones that we see. And I've included links to the pest notes that give you more detailed information how to take care of each of these plants. It's real important that you pay attention and notice these pests early before too much damage is done. So you identify the pest and learn how to manage it. And we, as master gardeners, strongly recommend using the least damaging, least toxic methods first. And this is a process called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. And the link at the bottom of the page will take you directly to that site that will help you identify what the pest is and how to take care of it. It's important to be tolerant, accept a certain amount of disease or pest damage. It can be tolerated in your home garden. Homegrown vegetables don't need to look grocery store perfect in order to be healthy and delicious. So we want you to use a combination of biological, cultural, physical, mechanical, or chemical management tools in that order of progression. So start by picking off those worms off your tomatoes and things like that. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over how to deal with all of these plants, or excuse me, pests. All right, next slide. Finally, I do encourage that you start a garden journal or keep notes. In particular, I planted a tomato years ago that I didn't write down which one it was. And it was the best tomato that produced the most plants. I was giving them away from this one in a pot, but I didn't write it down, and I've never gotten one like that again. So you want to note things that you likely won't remember next year. So for instance, the varieties you like or dislike, the ones that did well or not so well, your planting dates, your harvest dates, what the weather was like, where you planted things in your garden, maybe take some pictures. And then any special notes about row spacing or garden pests. Remember, if you don't have failure, you don't know why things are succeeding. So that's a quote from Monty Don. And next slide. I am going to pass it on to Dawn to take us home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori. Appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. My name is Dawn Martella, and I'm a master gardener up here in Fiddletown. And I have really poor bandwidth up here. So for my section of the presentation, I'm going to go ahead and shut my video off, and then I'll turn it back on when it comes time for our questions. So let me go ahead and get this shut off. All right. So you've gotten information on how to get your bed set up. You now know what to plant. So it's now time to start thinking about how you're going to water them. Next slide, please. So before setting up your irrigation, there are a number of factors to consider. The first one is going to be your soil type. Kathy talked about this, and this is important because knowing the type of soil you have can tell you how fast the water is going to move through your beds. As Kathy mentioned, your sandy loam is going to drain a lot faster than a clay soil and will thus require more frequent watering. You know, if you have a heavy clay soil or a clay mixture in your soil, this might only need deep but infrequent watering. For your raised beds and all that, most garden soil mixtures tend to be on a loam or a sandy loam mixture. Just check the contents to make that determination. Your plants will need consistent water, and this is especially important during the early growth stages, doubly so if you're growing from seed, because you know the soil needs to be moist in order for the seed to germinate and also to allow the sprout to break through the surface. Consistent watering means that you don't want to let the soil surrounding the roots on your plants completely dry out, nor do you want to let your plants go through periods of extremely dry to extremely wet soil. The important thing to remember is that the soil should be moist, but not wet. Knowing where your feeder roots are located is helpful when it comes to the placement of your irrigation and fertilizer. Your plant roots will grow not only downward, but they're also going to grow outward horizontally away from the stem. So your primary feeder roots are located within those first 12 inches of depth, and these are the roots that are responsible for the uptake of water and nutrients. Since mulch typically isn't applied until after the soil warms up, and you need to wait until your plants get taller, so this is usually a few weeks after transplanting, you can use the time before this on figuring out how frequently you need to water, and you do so by checking that top 1 to 2 inches of soil. If that's dried out, that's a good indication that you need to water. Later on, when you mulch, make sure you check the soil underneath the mulch and not the mulch itself. You know, as Kathy talked about earlier, containers need more frequent watering, sometimes twice a day in hot weather. And while there's nothing nicer than hanging out in your garden in the morning, giving your plants a drink, this is something I enjoy doing, you know, listening to the birds and seeing how the day develops. Be careful. One of the biggest mistakes I see new gardeners make is a tendency to overwater. You know, your plants need oxygen and airflow around its roots. And if you saturate those roots, you're basically causing your plants to drown. So resist that urge to continually water. And instead, I recommend getting in the habit of just periodically checking your soil to see how frequent you need to water. In most instances, watering in the morning is best since it gives your plants the moisture needed to use throughout the day. But if your well is anything like mine, you might not be able to water all your plants in the morning. So in that case, you can split up your watering. Some plants can be watered in the evening. That's fine. Just be sure not to wet the plants so that way you don't have to deal with any fungal issues. Now, in the box on the right, there are 3 factors that work together when figuring your watering needs. These are depth, duration, and frequency. So depth is basically how deep does the water penetrate, and watering to that 12-inch depth is usually sufficient for most plants because that's where your feeder roots are located. The duration is how long you need to water in order to reach that desired depth. And a great way to check this, if you're not sure, is water how long you think it needs, and then wait a few hours. And then just next to where you watered, be careful not to disturb the roots, dig a 12-inch deep hole and look at the side of that hole. If you see that the water's penetrated all the way down, you've watered sufficiently. If it's only halfway, you might need to increase the amount of time that you water in order to get to that depth. And then lastly is the frequency, or how often. Shallow rooted plants might need daily water in hot summer temperatures. The deeper ones might not require it except for a few times a week. Those extremely hot weather events that we had like last summer, I think it was like 112 degrees in my garden, they might require you to temporarily increase that frequency. Sometimes on those very, very hot days, giving your plants a little extra drink at the very end of a hot day can keep them from getting too stressed. So just play it by ear. Next slide, please. Knowing your plant's root depths will also help understand your irrigation needs. So I've got a list here of your shallow rooted plants, and these are ones who send the roots down to about a 12-inch deep depth. So your corn, your lettuce, onions, etc. Your medium rooted plants can send roots up to 18 inches deep. And these are going to be your cucumbers, beans, summer squash, peas, and carrots. And then the deep rooted plants, these can go over 2 feet deep. And typically they're your tomatoes, your winter squash, and your pumpkins. Group your watering according to the plant's needs if possible. In my garden, I tend to keep my tomatoes and my winter squash in separate beds because I know these are going to need deep watering every few days. But as is the case with most gardeners, my other beds are a combination of both shallow and medium rooted plants. So in this case, because my beds are on drip, my shallow rooted plants will get a 1 gallon per hour emitter, while I'll use a 2 gallon per hour emitter on my medium rooted plants. If you're using a soaker hose setup, just simply water to meet the needs of your shallow rooted plants at that 12-inch depth, since that's usually sufficient. Next slide, please. So let's talk watering methods. Now, Kathy had mentioned about getting your irrigation set up before planting. I personally like to set mine up after planting, so I think that's a personal preference. What you want to do is get it set up before you apply your mulch, because those in-place systems like your soaker hoses and your drip are much more effective if they're placed under the mulch. The goal is to water the soil and not the mulch. So to start with, hand watering is the easiest, but it's also the most time consuming. Make sure that you're not flooding the plants. So don't turn it on full bore. And you want to water the root zone area of the plants and not the leaves. This is a great option for containers. And it's also useful if you're growing from seed, because you can hand water until the seedlings emerge and the plants become established, and then maybe transition to another watering method. I will hand water when I first set my plants out. I will use a gentle shower setting on my nozzle, and it works really well. Soaker hoses, these are great. These are an inexpensive and easy way to set up an irrigation in the bed. They're just basically that porous hose that allows the water to seep out. You don't need to turn the faucet on full bore. All you need to do is have enough so it pressurizes the hose. It is best placed under mulch because soaker hoses will rot in the sun and oftentimes need to be replaced on an annual basis. This is great for in-ground beds, it's great for raised beds, and it's something that's easily paired with a timer. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we come to drip irrigation, and this is a little bit more complicated and costly to set up. However, once it's done, you're really good to go for the most part. If you're new to gardening in general, you might want to wait until you get a growing season under your belt before doing this. but I encourage everyone to consider this method. It's really efficient. It ensures your plants get exactly what they need without wasting water. And especially this year, that's something that's pretty important. So drip irrigation is a great system. Most home faucets tend to have a lot higher pressure. So if you do have that, you either want to make sure that your volume's turned down, or you can pair the system with a pressure reducer. Place it under the mulch for the most effective use. And one of the things with drip systems are you do want to check them periodically for problems. I'll typically walk through my garden. Well, I walk through my garden every day, but I'll look and see if there's any emitters that are plugged or missing. I'll make sure that my connections are all tight. Because my well tends to have a little bit of a silt production, I will flush my lines once a month. So, you do need to check it out periodically. It's a great long-term option for all bed types, including containers. And because it's easily paired with a timer, this makes it nice. So if you do have your garden set up, you've got it on a timer, and you need to go away for a few days, you're good. Your garden's still going to get watered. As far as drip tubing is concerned, there are different types to choose from. The center picture shows two different rolls of drip tubing. The one on the right is your standard tubing, and the one on the left is the spaghetti tubing. In the standard tubing, and oftentimes this is usually about a 5/8 inch diameter, this is a tube where you add emitters as needed to each plant's location. There's another type of tubing called inline emitter tubing, and this is where the emitters are actually built in. And you can get this in either a standard or a spaghetti tubing. The distance between the emitters can vary. I personally like the setups with spaghetti tubing since it's a lot easier to snake around your plants. The standard tubing tends to be a little bit more rigid. So the photo on the upper left there is an example of a standard tube size inline emitter setup. Boy, try saying that 3 times fast. The photo on the bottom left shows standard tubing in which a spaghetti line was connected and that has an emitter at the end. And this is a really nice setup. I use it a lot in my garden. It allows you to move your emitter outward to remain in contact with those feeder roots that I talked about as your plant grows. Now, the middle picture, you're going to see a lot of drip components. The upper left is a pressure reducer. You've got hose connectors, T's, the elbows. They make a product for drip lines called goof plugs, Goof, and that's exactly what they are. Is when you goof and you punch a hole in the wrong spot, you can use a goof plug to go ahead and fill that hole. At the very bottom of the picture in the middle, you'll see 2 examples of emitters. They vary according to the manufacturer and appearance. And then on the far right, you're going to see a timer. And these are readily available. They're not too expensive. I think I pay around $30, $35 for one. They're battery operated and they're very easy to set up. The other thing that's nice about these is they have a manual button that allows for a single watering for a specified time entered. And I use this a lot when I'm checking my drip system. I'll set my manual time for a minute. It pressurizes my system. It allows me to make sure everything's connected properly and flush my lines. Next slide, please. So now your plants have grown, you've got your irrigation system in, and your soil has warmed. Because remember, we talked earlier about the importance of having warm soil when planting your garden. So once those all are met, now's the time to mulch in order to conserve all that precious moisture. Mulching is also really great at keeping the weeds down. And any weeds that do manage to grow through the mulch, I found are very easy to pull out. Okay, it's good for all types of garden beds. This can be for containers and in-ground and raised beds. And when it comes to raising vegetables, especially, I recommend using an organic mulch. So for your in-ground or your raised beds, using mulches like straw, you can do shredded dried leaves. You can even use pine needles, which are great. Dried lawn clippings work, but if you have Bermuda grass in your lawn, I caution against that because that does have a tendency to root and create an even greater problem. So when you place your mulch, you want to put it around your plants about a depth of 4 inches. I can even go up to 6 inches on taller plants like my tomatoes. You want to keep the mulch about 2 to 4 inches away from your plant stems in order to avoid any rot issues. When it comes to containers, straw, aged wood chips works great. You can use cocoa fiber. I know they make the cocoa mats, or you can buy the bricks that you can shred. Those work really well. If any of you are wine drinkers, wine corks work amazingly well because they're a lightweight mulch that allows air and moisture to go through. And if anybody gives you a hard time about drinking wine, you can just tell them that you're working on mulching your bed. When it comes to the area surrounding your bed, so these are your pathways and your walkways, mulch is fantastic at keeping weeds down. I'd recommend laying out a weed fabric. You can do newsprint, newspaper, even cardboard, and then covering that with a layer of wood chips, bark, or even pea gravel about 2 inches deep. One caution: if you're using either wood chips or bark on your walkways and you happen to live in an area with rattlesnakes, is it does make them harder to see. So I use wood chips on my walkways. And because I'm very rural and we do have rattlesnakes on the property, I've gotten into the habit of scanning my pathways just to ensure that I don't step on anything. It's not that big of a deal. And then lastly, you may need to refresh your mulch sometime during the growing season. I tend to use straw in my garden, and maybe on some plants, I might need to do a few handfuls around it just to boost it up, but it works great all season. And if you're using an organic mulch and other advantages at the end of the growing season, it just goes back into your soil as wonderful organic matter. Next slide, please. So let's talk fertilizer. As it says on the slide, fertilizers influence plant growth by improving the supply of available nutrients in the soil. Kathy talked earlier about the importance of creating good soil, and that is so true. You've got to start with good soil, but you will find that an occasional feeding will help keep your plants producing throughout the growing season. They're working hard, and just like us, they're going to need an occasional sustenance to stay in peak performance. So fertilizers are labeled with both the primary plant nutrients that they contain, and they can be either a complete or an incomplete fertilizer. If you look at the little picture on the right-hand side, you see a bag. It says nitrogen, ignore that, but it has the numbers 10, 5, 5. So this is a listing of all 3 of your primary plant nutrients. So nitrogen is your first nutrient. In this case, it's 10% nitrogen. Phosphate or phosphorus is your second nutrient, and that's 5%. And then the last nutrient is potassium, and that's also 5%. So if you see a bag that has, or you pick a fertilizer that has all 3 of those primary nutrients, that's a complete fertilizer. If you pick a fertilizer that might be like a 2100, that's an incomplete fertilizer, or one that might be 804. That again is incomplete. So always try to choose a complete fertilizer when using for your vegetable garden. And so let's talk about the primary nutrients. So nitrogen is probably the most important nutrient during the growing season. This is what helps with photosynthesis. It makes your plant grow. It helps it with its metabolism. If you have too little, you're going to see yellowing of leaves. You're going to see stunted growth, but too much can result in a lot of vegetative growth with very little fruit. I think the term is all hat and no cattle. Okay. And I've seen this happen too, where people way over fertilize their tomatoes. They're 6 feet tall. They're gorgeous. They're green. They're lush. And there's not one piece of fruit set. So remember, just do what you need to do, but not too much. Phosphate stimulates root and seed development. It's an important nutrient for photosynthesis. It's not a big issue when it comes to deficiencies. We don't really see this too often, but if you do have one, it can cause some really abnormal foliage color. You may see some heavy purpling of the leaves, or even a dark bronze is what I've seen in the past. Sometimes you'll see deep green on leaves that aren't really normal for that particular variety. You got to be careful, because if you use too much, that can result in an iron and a zinc deficiency. And so you'll see that by what's called chlorosis, where you get yellowing between the leaf veins, or you can even see the leaves bleaching. Now, potassium is a great nutrient. This is needed for the movement of water and sugars within the plant, and the production of starches and proteins are what helps your plant's fruit ripen. So if you have a deficiency in this, it can cause weak stems and poor fruit and seed development. But sometimes in these cases, acidic soil or even waterlogged soil can be a factor. So that can mimic a issue with a potassium deficiency. So if that is something that you think you might have, check your soil. If it's soggy, back off. If it's not and normally moist, you could do a pH check on your soil. If it's very low, you need to amend it in order to raise that up to about a 6.5–7%. Excess use can result in nitrogen, calcium, and magnesium deficiencies. So the main takeaway on this is do not over fertilize. Just because a little might be good for your plants, more is not always better. It causes problems like too much vegetative growth, too little fruit, deficiencies of other nutrients, and depending upon the type of fertilizer you use, overuse can also negatively impact the environment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when it comes to fertilizer choices, does it matter whether you use a synthetic fertilizer or an organic one? Well, it depends. So from a nutritional standpoint, they both will supply the primary nutrients that are needed for plant growth. So in that case, technically it doesn't. With regards to synthetic fertilizers, they're fast acting, but they might require more frequent applications. With a synthetic fertilizer, you might find that you're having to fertilize every week, and they are very easy to over apply. And if you do so, that can sometimes cause burning of the roots, and they can leach into the environment, contaminating groundwater. So it's something you want to be careful with. With regards to organic fertilizers, while they're slower to release, they do provide nutrients over a longer period of time. And this sometimes is a better option for your vegetable plants. Another nice thing about a lot of organic fertilizers is they may contain trace nutrients. So things like calcium, zinc, maybe some magnesium. Now, if I'm purchasing organic fertilizer, I'm looking for that OMRI indication because that just verifies that the products are in compliance with organic standards. I've listed some pictures here below. This is not a recommendation on any products whatsoever, but more of an example. So the three fertilizers on the left are synthetic. The three fertilizers on the right are organic. You'll see that only one of the synthetic ones has the primary nutrients listed. The others, you're going to need to read your back label. It's really important because that's going to contain all the information that you need. Next slide, please. Thank you. So your plants need to be about 3 to 4 inches tall before you start adding your fertilizer. And the exception to this are the tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, squash, cucumbers, and melons. For these, you actually want to wait until they've begun setting fruit until you apply your fertilizer. Read your label. Always apply at the rate and the interval that's listed. So how much and how often. And on this, a good example might be something like, say the back label says, apply 1 cup of fertilizer for every 10 feet of row length. Or for containers, use 1 tablespoon of fertilizer for a 5-gallon container and fertilize every 3 weeks. Again, that back label is going to have the directions that you will need to follow and do it according to what they recommend. Always use a primary or a complete fertilizer, and don't assume that one that's high in the primary nutrients is better. Usually a mid-grade, like an 848 or something like that, is pretty solid for what your plants are going to need through the growing season. Now, there are 2 ways to apply your fertilizer. One way is called broadcasting, and this is where you're going to sprinkle the prescribed amount of fertilizer around your plant, and you're going to do it about 4 to 6 inches away from the stem because you want that fertilizer in that area where those feeder roots are. You're going to lightly mix it into the soil. Be careful not to damage the roots. And then if you're doing a side dressing method, you'll again, 6 inches away from your plant, you're going to dig a shallow, maybe a 2-inch trench. alongside, sprinkle your fertilizer in according to the rate that they recommend. And then once your fertilizer is in, this is really important, and that is that you need to make sure that it's in contact with the soil. The nitrogen in the fertilizer, if it's not in contact with the soil, has a tendency to fix in the atmosphere. And if it does that, it's not doing your plants any good. Water your fertilizer in after applying. You want to do a nice deep watering on that. And remember that fertilizer takes time to work. You know, don't wait until deficiencies appear, because it could be a week or two before you see results. Next slide, please. So this slide's going to give you some ideas of where to go for your various gardening needs. I mean, there's a lot of resources out there. And if you're going to plant a garden this year, now is the time to get ready. So for your soil and amendments, Kathy had a lot of great suggestions as far as finding the composted horse manure. Also, nursery and garden centers have good soils. You can, if you're doing raised bed, you can do a good quality raised bed soil mixture. If down the road you decide that gardening is your new endeavor and you're going to be expanding your gardening, maybe purchasing in bulk might be a little bit more economical. And so you can just search for bulk garden soil providers under landscape materials. That'll help. For plants and seeds, your seed catalogs, your nursery and your garden center is great. But if you get your beds ready now, they'll be ready in time to plant when the Master Gardeners has our plant sale on May 7th. And this is a great sale. We're going to have tons of vegetables as well as herbs, some roses, succulents, all of that. And you're also going to find a greater variety than you would at any other type of garden center. So it's something to definitely check out. For the hardware cloth, you know, if you're doing a smaller bed or underneath your pots, you know, your big box store, your building supply centers typically will sell shorter rolls. If you decide to expand your beds and you're going to need to purchase hardware cloth in a large quantity, it typically comes in 100-foot length, and it can come either 3 feet or 4 feet wide. And in these cases, places like the feed store, fruit grower supply, or the internet might be the way to go. As far as irrigation supplies, you know, if you're just starting out, for the basic things like your soaker hoses and your timers, your garden centers, your big box stores work great. I've seen some garden centers that have very extensive irrigation supplies, which is nice. But if you decide to transition to drip irrigation in a big way, I'd really recommend checking out a commercial irrigation supply. These not only have better pricing, believe it or not, but the staff there is very, very knowledgeable. So you can go in with your measurements on your beds and talk to them, and they can help you select exactly what it is that you need. Lastly, your fertilizers, you know, your garden center or nursery are going to have the best selection. The internet will too. Remember to read that back label. That's what's important, because that's going to not only tell you the rate and how to apply, but some of the fertilizers may only list their percentages on the back label. Next slide, please. So we've given you a lot of information today. I know it's a lot to distill, but here's some links that you're going to find really helpful going forward. So Amador Master Gardeners, we're here to help you. Our website has lots of articles, has past presentation videos, all of that. As we say, our motto is advice to grow by. California Garden Web is a division of UCANR, and it's a wonderful resource for not only vegetable plants, but also landscape plants. Gives you a broad range of information to cover. Lori talked about integrated pest management, or IPM. So definitely, if you have issues with your plants, you can look it up and identify and receive a lot of great information on how to manage it. I've also included the list for the Amador County planting guide that Lori presented, because it's really helpful to know when you need to plant. And then UC has some great publications. In their publication catalog, they've got books, that you can purchase, but they've also got a lot of great articles and pamphlets that are free for downloading. I put a link up for an article on vegetable garden basics. A lot of what we've covered today is presented in this article. And then lastly, if you're not sure where to find something and you're searching on the internet and you don't know if the results are going to give you stuff for Pennsylvania, which really isn't applicable here, or it's an old wives' tale, and maybe you're looking for something that's a little bit more science-based. If you precede your search term, so with the letters UCANR, and then enter your search term. So I might put UCANR growing tomatoes, and it's going to pop up with all these great links on Master Gardener articles and everything. So just really helpful when you search. And then lastly, I want to let you know how happy we are that you joined us today. You know, gardening is so enjoyable. It's a fulfilling endeavor, and you guys are about to embark on a journey that I think is going to delight you for a lifetime. So on behalf of Amador Master Gardeners, I want to thank you for your interest and wish you all happy gardening. So now we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Okay, this is Maureen. I'm going to go ahead and start the questions. We have just a few of them so far. If anyone else has a question, though, while we're answering these, please type them into the chat box. Okay, we'll start. This is probably a common question for people if they're going to use manure. Denise wants to know if when you use the horse manure, is it 100% or is it mixed with anything? And I think that was either Lori or Kathy, but I'm sure any of you could answer that.
Well, I'd be glad to answer it. It just sort of depends what the source is. In some places, it's going to be 100%. Not likely. There's almost always going to be others, but especially if they use a lot of bedding around their horses, there's going to be a whole lot of that mixed in. That's one of the reasons, couple of reasons that you want it aged. If they've used a lot of bedding, you want to not have that. You could end up with a lot of seed sprouts coming out of that. If it's aged, chances are less likely. The other thing of it is when manure first comes out of the horse, it's pretty strong, and it needs to sit around in the air for a while to get to where it'll be calmer for you. Anyone else have anything more to say?
Yeah, I would also recommend amending it, like Kathy, you talked about that earlier.
Oh,
you know, if you're using a composted manure,
yep.
definitely amend it. You can mix it in with amendments or purchase garden soil, which will really help. And that way you're not going to worry about burning your plants.
True. Good points.
Just a quick comment. I kind of overdid it with horse manure in one of my raised beds last year. And I got the tomato plants Dawn was talking about. They were 6 feet and beautiful and absolutely no flowers or tomatoes. So I'm going to back off this year on that. But I had great looking plants.
Yeah, that's early on when you first plant things. That's when you really need to use a lot of nitrogen. When you start getting some flowering coming up and fruits getting set, then back off some on the nitrogen. You don't really need a lot, or you will end up with 6-foot high plants with nothing on them.
I can guarantee you that. Okay, our next one, oh wait, let me move this back, is, oh, okay, we got a couple more in here. This one kind of speaks to our next public ed class, but I'll let you ladies speak to it. How to grow rose bushes from clippings.
My response to that was, yeah, we're having a class in a couple of weeks at the Heritage Rose Garden that they're going to discuss that specifically. So I invite you to attend. That's our first in-person since COVID.
It'll be April 9th at 9 o'clock at the Heritage Rose Garden.
And the address is on the screen right there.
This is the plant sale ad on the screen right now. But that's where
The
the
plant sale is the
class-
same
yes.
address.
right. Thanks, Ed. Okay, next, Marta, you kind of commented on this, but what exactly is an emitter? An emitter in the drip irrigation line?
So emitter is a little button that basically is plugged into your irrigation tubing, and it's an opening, and it allows water to come out at a prescribed rate. Okay, so emitters run anywhere from a half a gallon per hour up to 4 gallon per hour.
And that kind of leads us to the next one, Dawn. How long do you leave the water on in your drip irrigation system?
So what I talked about when I talked about irrigating, remember I talked about depth, duration, and frequency. You want to water to that 12-inch depth. So you're going to need to turn your emitters on. If you're using a drip system, turn it on how long you suspect it might need. And then a few hours later, dig near the emitter, dig a 12-inch hole, and check the sidewalls of your hole. Because if it's wet all the way down, that means that you've watered long enough. If it's only part of the way, you might need to increase the time. Maureen, you're on mute.
I know, I apologize. My dog started barking. Somebody just got here. I apologize. I had to run into the other room.
Of course.
The next is a question though on what is your thought on using fish emulsion as a fertilizer?
I like using fish emulsion early on when I'm growing my plants. When I started in my greenhouse, I do a weak mixture of it because it's providing the nitrogen that the plants needed to do that rapid growth.
Right.
During the growing season, it may not provide enough of the potassium that your plants will need, especially once they start setting fruit, but early on in the season, it's fine.
I agree.
Okay, next, the presenter said too much compost would allow. Okay, I'm not sure of the exact question. Can
Okay.
you re-explain the issue of having too much compost?
Okay, yeah, I can, because I was the one that made the comment about it. Early on, the whole picture of what I said was that early on when we developed the teaching garden, we decided to use it as to try experiments out there and see what did work and also what didn't work. I mean, we thought that that was just as important to find out. We used too much compost. The water just drained right through. It made the soil too loose, so it didn't hold any water. And we had to work we had to dig the whole stupid thing out. I mean, it took hours and worked some real soil back into it. And then it worked fine. But so don't ever go for say, well, gee, if a little compost is good, more is better. Not always true. So that's what I was saying.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay. Next is for soil amendments. Check with your neighbors. Oh, this is a comment from John, is just to check with your neighbors. They may have animals that can help you with manure. Although you do have to look up what the seasoning time is on that.
Yes, you do.
Kathy mentioned the horses. It was hot coming out. It is in the other.
Chicken
Do
is
either of
Yeah.
do you guys want to comment on that as far as chickens and rabbits?
Chicken's terrible. Chicken is really strong. So that really that definitely has to be bleached. Rabbits, I don't know.
I've used rabbit manure and chicken manure in my garden. Chicken manure, you do have to compost for at least 6 months because it'll burn the crap out of your plants. Rabbit manure is pretty benign. So a lot of rabbit manure, you can actually incorporate it right away. And because it's got a lot of organic matter in it, it's really lovely as fluffing up and lightening your soil too.
Kind of like the bunnies. All right, what about using
Yeah.
medium or large fabric growing containers, our famous grow bags, versus pots or raised beds? Anybody want to comment? I know a lot of us use the grow bags.
I don't know a lot about them. They're good. There's no question about that. My prejudice is towards the harder sided pots, but I don't have any real reason for saying that.
Lori, Dawn? I know last year when we experimented with them, when it got really, really hot, we felt that that was kind of an issue. Ed Bass, do you want to comment? You were running that.
Well, I found that they dried out, but one of the things to conserve water is I put my grow bags tight against another grow bag
Yeah,
so that it reduced the evaporation from the sides.
yeah, that would be my concern about a grow bag, that the water would evaporate too fast.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this is in ground, but I'm not sure. Would you suggest water troughs between plants? I'm not sure if that's raised bed or in ground.
It's either one. You can do it. You're using a lot more water than maybe you need to because of the fact that you're flooding. You're doing basically what's called flood irrigation, and you'll see this in commercial ag. I'd recommend really targeting the water to the individual plants, so that way you're not wasting water and your plant's getting the maximum benefit.
Early on, I mentioned something about, I had a neighbor who had sunk, what was it, half-gallon or quart-sized pots down to the
Right.
ground level, and that he would, this was around his tomatoes. And by midsummer, when the roots had really sort of grown down some, he would fill those pots up so the water was just held in one small area. It wasn't a whole row. You weren't having to fill a whole row. You were just having to fill that pot, and the water was going straight to the roots. I thought it was a terrific idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great idea too, because it does help target the plant. And again, you're not watering excess areas around it. You know, there are products out there called olas, which are basically these shaped clay pots that you can bury in the soil. But I think if you're using a can, it's a lot less expensive. And then you're also recycling and repurposing.
Actually, what he was using was, you know, the black plastic pots that your plants come in from the nursery. He would go buy his plant.
Perfect.
And clean the pot out and then just stick that down in the ground. So yeah, you're right. He was repurposing.
And I also used, it was from one of the CE classes we had. I bought them on Amazon. They were these little stakes that you stuck on the ground that had a valve, and you took a used water bottle and you filled it with water and slowly dripped in too. So if you have, I have plants on a pallet that I put, and it's not really set up for drip system, but this just helps keep them watered on a more uniform basis. It's not real pretty all the time, but at least my plants are healthy. So
Thanks. Lots of good ideas. Okay, our next question was actually, what does ANR stand for? But John Otto stepped up and he already answered it: agricultural and natural resources. But we do have a question. Could you please review complete versus incomplete fertilizer again?
Sure. So your complete fertilizers contain all three of the primary plant nutrients. That's your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium. An incomplete fertilizer will only contain one or two of those, but not all three.
Anybody else? That's pretty clear. Thanks.
That's pretty good right there.
Yeah. Okay, our last question that's been typed in is related to chicken manure, but you just answered that one. Oh, wait, we got a last one to. Oh, this is another comment from John related to the grow bags. I'm not sure who can see it. To slow down the draining of water in pots and grow bags, add some higher clay soil at the bottom inch or two. So that's a whole class in itself. Comments and anybody, because this looks like it's our last question, and then you have thank yous coming to you.
Well, I see one question on here I don't think we addressed. As can I reuse the soil from the previous year's raised plant or bed? Or do
I missed that one. Yeah, go for it, Kathy.
Or do I need to buy fresh raised soil? Unless you have money that you like to waste, you don't need to buy used or new soil every year. And in fact, it's better not to, because you have all the mycorrhizae and other such nutrients growing in the soil that it takes the aged soil, last year's soil to have that in it. But the thing of it is that you can, in the winter time, you can do something called planting cover crops, which is a whole other section. And one of these days, get into it. I didn't get into it for a few years after but cover crops fix nitrogen into your soil, and they reinvigorate it for the following year so that you have really good soil. Now, vegetables in particular will eat a lot of soil. They devour it. And so yet you will have to add soil each year. There's no way around that one. But try not to stir up the stuff that you have there. Let it stay as it is so that the mycorrhizae and such continue to grow and don't get chopped up every time.
Kathy, can I add something? We actually got a call into the call line, and they asked if they could use, they were given soil that people had used to raise pot plants. And we recommended no on that one because of the chemicals that they use, and that would be unknown. So that, you got to know who your soil's coming from, apparently, because that kind of surprised us, but we researched it and recommended not to use soil from your neighbor growing pot plants. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, I think I would agree. The pot plants wouldn't necessarily turn me off, but I would want to know about my soil.
That was it. They didn't know what they may have used on it.
Right, exactly. And particularly if you're looking to do everything in an organic fashion, they may have used a whole lot of mechanical stuff. And so that soil may really not be suited for your purposes.
Well, with that, you have lots of great comments. Oh, somebody else, go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing I'd like to mention with the soil too, because Kathy talked about this earlier a little bit, but after you grow your garden and at the end of the season, you don't have to add more soil, although you might need to fill the volume, but you definitely want to amend your soil each year before you're planting, because you're giving that soil that little extra nutritional boost that it needs to start everything off.
Thank you. We have a question about, it's basically tilling, and I'm going to cover two right now. I'll let you guys cover the turning the soil, but this presentation will be on our website within a few days. There's a question as to when they can see the video. What time? What are we? Who's calling this? Doris, are you calling the time on this?
I am, and we've still got a little bit of time. We were
Okay.
off at 11, so.
Do you want to comment on turning this? This says we aren't supposed to turn the soil, but it's written as a question.
I recommend light cultivating. There's no-till methods, and then there's what's called low-till methods. And so, like Kathy talked about, you've got the mycorrhiza, you've got all this wonderful fungal hyphae in your soil that you worked so hard to develop it. And if you rototill your soil to death, you're just going to remove that beautiful structure of the soil. It's going to cause it to compact and not really put water through very well. So in my garden, I have to deep dig my garden beds every year because I have oak trees on the perimeter, and even though they're 50 feet away, they send roots all the way up to the bottom of my beds. So I use a broad fork and I gently turn my soil over, and I do that when I'm incorporating my my compost and my aged fertilizers or my aged manures early in the spring. And you're not disturbing the soil so much that it's just, like I said, it's not going to ruin it, but you might need to do it just to get everything mixed up. Anybody else?
No, that sounds,
Agree.
yeah.
Okay, the last couple comments, actually Doris answered. She posted the link where this presentation will be available. And there will also be a list of links, and all of these will be posted. on our website for Amador Master Gardeners. Any other questions? This is a long one, ladies.
I just like to say, you know, as a beginning gardener who's a master gardener, you're always learning something, and do look for those resources and do ask for help, because it's kind of fun to see your progress and see what grows. So
No. So, I mean, even though this presentation was listed as Gardening 101, I'm sure that that all of us, even those of us who are experienced gardeners, have learned some things today.
Oh, Carolyn's adding a comment she's making a plea for pollinators.
No comment. I just don't know.
We have master gardeners that are on the list here that are attending your presentation, just like Lori just said, because we all learn every time we watch one of these.
Yeah.
and if you do visit the Amador County website, you can see some past presentations. And I believe there was one on cover crops. There's one on pollinators. There's one on raised beds specifically, or different kinds like the straw bales. There's just a lot of information there if you take the time to go look, because we couldn't cover it all today. There's just too much.
And I think we're up on YouTube also.
Yeah, and there's something that's so nice about, even though you might have vegetables in your garden, if you interplant some marigolds and you interplant some pollinator flowers in there, it just is such a beautiful view overall. You know, it's landscaping that's edible in my view.
I agree entirely. It's totally fun that way.
Thank you so much for attending our presentation about Gardening 101 today. Remember, this presentation will be posted on our website early next week if you should want to review it. Happy gardening.